Our reading this week is going to be in Luke chapter 19. So let's give you a couple things to be thinking about and watching for. First of all, just sort of overviewing the chapter as a whole. We open with that familiar story at
Right.
the front. In the first 10 verses, we have the story of Zacchaeus. And we commented last week that it's interesting to parallel that story with the rich young ruler.
That's
That
right.
he kind of serves as a foil for
That's
the
right.
rich young ruler, who seems to have it all
Yeah.
and yet doesn't.
Right.
And Zacchaeus doesn't seem to be a guy at all fit for the kingdom.
Admits he's defrauded people effectively. In other words, he's not been keeping the Ten Commandments.
Right. But he's willing to give it up.
That's
To
right.
What I need to give up to make restitution, I'll do it. Unlike the rich young ruler who said, well, I'm not willing to do that.
Yeah. Walks away.
Okay, so then in 11 through 27, this story is probably going to be recognized better as the parable of the talents from one of the other gospels. But
Right.
this is actually a little bit different parable.
It's a twist.
It is,
It's
isn't
a
it? Let's
twist.
talk about that a little bit.
Sure. The issue here is given away in chapter 19, verse 11, just like the parables in chapter
Yeah.
18, where Jesus tells why he's telling a parable. Verse 11 makes very clear what the real dynamic in this parable is about. There's certainly still a stewardship angle, but part of what he wants them to get out of this parable, he says at the beginning, he told them this parable because he was near to Jerusalem, and they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. And so he tells a story about a king who goes away for a while and expects his stewards to do well. And that's the real issue here, is the absent king and finding what he expects when he returns, and dealing with those who don't want him to rule over them. That's
Right.
part of how it ends as well. When after the reckoning over stewardship, verse 27, but as for those enemies of mine who did not want me to reign, bring them here and slaughter them before me. So the issue is,
Yeah, that could be a tough spot in that text, what exactly that means. That's different than the talent story.
That's right. That's right. Because ultimately, the stewardship sits in this larger bubble of the kingdom of God is not going to come immediately with him coming into Jerusalem here, which is what he's doing in this chapter. He's coming to Jerusalem. He's not going to launch a kingdom on earth yet, and the people he is supposed to reign over may not want the kind of king that he intends to be in this kingdom that's not arriving immediately.
That's also interesting too when you think about back in 18, how he's trying to tell the disciples
Right.
how this is going to go down.
That's right.
And they're not getting it. And so
Right.
this parable kind of links to that, because
Right.
what it means is I'm going to go away for a while and expect you to work.
That's
And
right.
So in the meantime,
That's right.
here's what you need to be doing. At 28, important turning point in the gospel story, because
Yes.
we've been making the journey to Jerusalem and now we're here.
We're here.
And this grand moment where he enters the city, everything looks perfect, doesn't
Right.
it?
And again, you get to the end of that, David, verse 38, they're all saying, blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven, glory on the highest. That sounds like Luke's telling of the birth, right?
Right, yeah.
And the angels are saying, and so, on the surface, it sounds good, but do they really see? Especially like that parable he just told about the kingdom is not going to be what you expect, and you may not like the kind of king I actually am. So they're singing great songs. It looks good. But we're going to find out that it gets a little more complicated here in just a moment.
Well, it's so I wasn't sure when I was kind of trying to think about how to break this out,
Mm-hmm.
what to do with the last little segment, those last four verses, 45 through 48,
Yeah.
where he goes into the temple. You could probably tuck that into his coming into Jerusalem, but that
Right.
is sort of an event that's set apart there, where he goes in and he cleanses the temple, which, by the way, raises a question.
Mm-hmm.
Because we had a cleansing of the temple, which is at least recorded at the front side of his ministry, and now we've got one here recorded at the backside toward
Right.
the end.
Right.
And the question is, well, are those two different
Sure.
incidents, or one that's just put in a different
Right.
place?
Yeah, and especially John's gospel, John chapter 2, there
Right.
the cleansing is, a cleansing at least, is at the beginning of John's telling of the story. And so here's I think what we do with this, David. In one sense, it is worth wrestling with that and thinking about that. But for our ultimate purposes, I don't know that it's truly significant whether you're one or two in and of itself. One of the things that we know from looking at the four Gospels carefully and just seeing where other events happen, is that the Gospels sometimes put events not in chronological order, but where they make sense for the portrait of Jesus. The Gospels are sometimes organized thematically, not
Yes.
chronologically.
Right. Like well, Matthew groups
Right.
miracles and parables
Correct.
together.
And so that's really our job as readers of the Gospels, is not so much even to try to harmonize the four sometimes. It's what we're trying to do this year with this reading through Luke this way. It's learning to read a gospel on its own merits and say, in the way that this writer tells the story, in the things that he puts in, the things that we sit there and say, I've read another gospel, this story or this parable, he didn't have it. Why? Take the gospel on its own merit and say, what is Luke trying to accomplish by telling the story in this way? What am I supposed to see about Jesus that John wasn't showing or Matthew wasn't showing, but Luke wants me to see?
So at the end of the day, the important thing is the event.
That's right.
And the message it communicates about Jesus. What about a broad overarching theme throughout all of this chapter? Are we still seeing that same idea of who's in and who's
Yeah.
out that we've been following really for some time through the gospel?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, just this whole, what is the kingdom and who's really going to be in it? We talked about the Messianic banquet a few weeks ago and the surprises at who's at the Lord's dinner table when all is said and done. And yeah, I think to your point, David, we're still there. I mean, Zacchaeus is a surprise.
Yeah, who is he?
admit.
How does this guy get in? He's a tax collector.
Right. And then Jesus on the other side is telling a parable, warning that there are going to be those who don't want to accept his rule. The kingdom is not going to come immediately, but there are going to be those who don't want it. And then you get this triumphal entry that on one level, the people seem to be saying, we're in. And yet Jesus, verses 41 through 44, is weeping over them, saying, you didn't know the day of your visitation. You really didn't realize fully what's going on. And I think that day of visitation line is really the setup for that cleansing of the temple, where, in the Bible, a day of God's visitation, especially in the Old Testament, and the New Testament, First Peter hints at this a little bit as well. A day of visitation is really a day of God's judgment, when God comes to inspect a people or a nation or a place. And so what does he do immediately next? He goes into the temple
like what he sees.
and he doesn't like what he sees. And so in one sense, and that's going to set up chapter 20, the controversies of chapter 20. God is not happy on the day of visitation. So Jesus is actually weeping as he goes in. Is Jerusalem going to be in or out? Well, that's what we're about to see in the next couple of chapters.
So just by way of application, to think about some things here that are useful for all of us and how we live our life. I thought back about the servants and the money.
Yeah.
And the underlying obligation there, that people who are going to be in are people who take what the master's given them
And bring him something for
and
it.
use it
right.
to his glory.
That's right.
What's important is not what he gave you, because we didn't all get the same thing.
That's right.
But that he gave us something that's
Right.
meant to be used and used to his glory. So as we work in chapter 19 this week, it'd be good to sort of ponder that as an application. Am I using what God has entrusted to me to his glory? Hope you enjoy your read of Luke chapter 19.